Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Family Conflict and Alzheimer's, an Action Plan. I'm Mike Bias with the Alzheimer's Association, and today we'll be examining some of the dynamics that affect nearly every family dealing with Alzheimer's to one extent or another. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to point out a few things on your screen so that you can get the most out of today's webinar. Directly under our webcams, you'll see the Program Notes pod, where if you're joining us live, you can click to download the notes and the PowerPoint slides that will help you refer back to those later on. If you're viewing this as a recording, you can download those notes at alzwebinars.org. Now, all the way in the bottom left of your screen, you'll see the Q&A pod, where if you have questions, you can type in any questions that you may have for our speaker today. And this is confidential. Nobody else will be able to see your name. Now, just to practice using that Q&A pod, how about if everybody types in their zip code? We've got people registered from literally from California to Massachusetts and Illinois and all points in between. So if you can go ahead and just type in your zip code, that gives us a good idea of who's joining us today. Great. Okay. Speaking about our speaker, we're pleased to have with us today Julia Perriello, who's a certified dementia practitioner and a master's level counselor, and the manager of Helpline and Community Referrals for the Massachusetts, New Hampshire chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. Welcome, Julia. How are you?
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Before we begin, I just want to let everybody know that you don't have a magic wand, although I was hoping that you did, that you will help everyone else's families become normal families. But rather, you're going to teach us how we can navigate these difficult waters of family conflict.
That's right. Yeah. So we hope that today's program, after the time we have together, that you'll leave feeling a little bit less alone, knowing that family conflict is very common, and that you'll have some additional tools for communication and maybe preventing conflict or navigating conflict as it arises, and understanding where to turn for outside support if you need it.
Great.
So I will get started. So, like I said, family conflict is so common, and we wanted to talk about it today for that reason. I think it's common in all families, but particularly among families who are caring for a person with dementia. Um, we know that the reason for that is that dementia has unique challenges due to um, both physical and cognitive symptoms. Um, Due to the progressive nature of the disease, things are constantly changing. In my work with families, I've heard people say that they feel like they're never caught up, or just as soon as they feel that they have a handle on things, symptoms unfortunately may change, and it can feel like it's back to the drawing board with figuring out what's next. Dementia can often cause changes in family roles. So a common change might be an adult child starting to care for their parent, and it can feel like a bit of a role reversal. We also know that caregivers for people with dementia statistically um, show higher levels of stress than other caregivers who are caring for people who don't have dementia. So the 2019 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures report reports on this. And I think in general, at least for me, I imagine for many of us, when we're under a great deal of stress, navigating difficult interpersonal relationships or difficult conversations is harder than ever. When I'm feeling particularly stressed, I'm just not at my best, and I'm um, more likely to be a little bit more cranky and maybe not handle situations in the way that I want to. So we can imagine that this is just magnified for family caregivers.
Well, Julia, I've always thought that I had a crazy family, but I swear everyone I talk to says the same thing. Oh, my family's crazy. So, I mean, it's good for you to help us understand that number one, it's normal. Every family is quote unquote crazy. And number two, when you throw Alzheimer's in or another dementia into the mix, it magnifies it quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody feels that their family is particularly difficult, but um, we know, or I've heard in talking with many, many people through my work with the Alzheimer's Association, that these situations are just really challenging. They're really, really nuanced, and there's a great deal of um, pain and grief and sadness and stress and transition and uncertainty. And so, of course, it brings up disagreements and conflict.
Dredges up a lot of the old childhood stuff.
Yeah, it really can. So every family is totally different. I just wanted to highlight some of the various issues that I've heard in working with families that are on this slide. So um, that might be disagreements about the actual disease. Sometimes there's one family member who um, is really accepting of a diagnosis and wants to move forward with care planning. And sometimes there might be another family member who's in a bit of denial or really just doesn't want to talk about it or face it. And that can be a common conflict we hear about. Um, Disagreements about care, about next steps to take, and what might be best for their loved one with dementia. That's quite common. Folks, particularly sometimes siblings, um, feeling like they got the short end of the stick, or that they're trying harder or giving more in terms of time and energy than anyone else. These are the common things that we hear about. But I hope that those of you who are joining us can just sort of reflect on maybe what issues have caused conflict in your family, and maybe that's not conflict that results in a big verbal altercation. Maybe these are just sort of unspoken disagreements or um, annoyances or resentments that have built up. But regardless, we hope that some of the tools that I'll speak about today will be helpful to you.
So it looks like there's, especially with Alzheimer's complicating things, just trying to get everyone on the same page when you have a loved one with Alzheimer's, everyone in the family coming from a different place, um, just getting everybody on the same page is going to be very, very difficult. And if you haven't had conflict yet, you probably can just wait a little bit and it'll happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, right? Some of these big decisions are quite polarizing, and so it's natural that everyone brings their own sort of worldview, their own lens, their own experiences. We bring that to all of our lives, but when it comes to these sort of quite life changing decisions about someone else's um, care, it can get pretty difficult. So where do we begin, right? So before we kind of get into some tools or strategies, I wanted to highlight that a helpful place to start off is to begin to reflect and become aware of um, your family's automatic patterns or automatic ways of functioning. So every family has a history, right, of patterns and roles and unspoken rules. It can just feel like it's just the way it is, maybe in your family. Oftentimes, these things are not spoken about, they're not even maybe on the surface or conscious, but they really can impact the way you relate to each other, the way you relate to the person with dementia, um, the way you cope with stress and make decisions. So, some examples of these types of automatic patterns in families are patterns of emotional expression. So, what's okay to express? Is anger or sadness okay to express, or is that mostly kept to oneself? Um, what's normal in your family in terms of decision making? For instance, has it always been your parents that have made decisions, and maybe now your parent has dementia and is less able to make those choices? Um, Maybe it's always been the men who've made decisions, or always the women, and how is that coming into play now? Um, what are patterns in your family around seeking help or asking for help? Is it okay to ask for help? Um, who is it okay to ask for help from? Is it okay to ask for help from a therapist, or maybe not, or maybe only someone from your church, etc. So I want to encourage you all to reflect on this, because awareness alone can go a long way in terms of building compassion and understanding for ourselves, for our own behaviors and the ways we're responding, as well as building compassion and understanding of our family members. Um, in addition, just awareness of these patterns can be the first step towards making changes if old patterns are no longer helping us in the present situation of caring for the person with dementia. It might be time to think about starting to behave in a new way that's more helpful for this situation.
It's interesting that you say awareness because there's a saying, the fish doesn't know that it's swimming in water. And I know in my family the spouses of the adult children have been instrumental in helping us realize, oh, there are, everyone will say, well, we don't have any rules in our family. Well, they're unwritten, and there's and we get the spouses who say, well, I noticed that your family does it this way.
Yeah.
Whether it's you guys don't hug very much, or you don't say I love you because you're Dutch, or whatever it is, and you can get insight from some of the spouses or people outside of the family and realize, wow, we really do have a lot of unwritten rules, and you don't really appreciate it until someone else tells you.
Absolutely, right? And I think that really resonates for me, Mike. I think having that objective person who's outside the family hasn't been living within that dynamic their whole life often has sort of fresh eyes on the situation. And it's not necessarily that any dynamic is good or bad, but just by seeing it, right, by bringing it to the surface, we can start to notice it and maybe respond a little bit differently next time if we want to. So for the rest of the time we have together, I'm going to talk through these five strategies for communication and for managing conflict. Some of these strategies are more geared towards opening up lines of communication within your family around caregiving so that hopefully we can prevent um, stressful conflict. And then some of these strategies are more geared towards tense conversations or ways of communicating when you're in the midst of a difficult conflict or an argument. Before we begin, I'll just highlight that these are not steps to completion, and they're not really a checklist. Unfortunately, there isn't any one thing you could do to say, oh, okay, I've done it, and now there'll be no more family conflict, right? We know that because of these difficult situations, um, it's necessary to navigate ongoing conversations. And my hope is that you'll take what resonates with you today and add them to your toolbox, and you'll be able to draw from these tools again and again as you continue to navigate dementia caregiving.
Now, earlier I joked about hoping that you had a magic wand so you could change everyone else in my family, but what you're doing here is you're giving me tools where I can communicate differently and be more effective within my family, whether they change or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great point, Mike. There really isn't any way to change other people. I mean, it's a complicated that's complicated, but we can't change others. We can't control others. All we can do is do our part to either de-escalate conflict, do our part to communicate our best so that we can prevent conflict if possible. Um, we can do our best to not amplify conflict, and sort of that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first strategy I'd like to share is to communicate early and often. So when conversations are difficult or uncomfortable, most families avoid them, right? So many families wait until things come to a head um, to have some of the most difficult caregiving conversations. Maybe that's a conversation about um, long-term care planning and whether it would ever be an option to have the person that you love move into a different home or move into a residential care facility or move into your home, right? So these conversations are complicated and difficult. Many families wait for a crisis, maybe a hospitalization or a new illness or a fall, to have these difficult conversations. But unfortunately, that's really the worst time to have a difficult talk because the pressure's on, right? So in these situations, sometimes decisions have to be made in a split, and in a number of hours or a number of days. Um, and people are under a lot of stress and not at their best. So ideally, conversations about care would be happening as early as possible and regularly. Um, if it's possible to set aside a time when everyone will be um, as relaxed as possible and comfortable, and then to put a system in place. So to schedule regular family meetings or phone calls in order to check in with each other about caregiving plans. How are things going with your loved one with dementia? What's working? What's not working? And does anything need to change? This opens up a forum for people to be able to bring their thoughts and opinions, so resentments don't build, right? And so people can ask for what they need and give feedback to each other. It's so much easier to talk, right, when we don't have to break the ice, when we don't have to request a meeting or feel like we're bothering people, when the forum already exists before a problem happens. It just makes it that much easier on anyone, even if the conversation content is still a little bit difficult. So within these conversations, right, what to talk about? I think that, like I mentioned earlier, we've been talking about these automatic ways of functioning in our families, and sometimes when it comes to caring for a person with dementia, families just kind of operate under these automatic roles. Maybe there's one family member who just jumps right into action and creates a plan of care and starts implementing it. Maybe there's another family member who kind of hangs back. Maybe they retreat and sort of wait to be instructed, or maybe they wait to be asked for help. What I've seen is that this, without talking about it, um, this can build misunderstanding. Misunderstandings can occur. It can build resentment. Um, so what's better is if caregiving can be explicitly discussed. Um, how this might look is, talking through specific caregiving roles and responsibilities. Maybe making a list of everything that needs to be done and how much time, energy, and money is needed in order to accomplish those tasks for or with the person with dementia. Maybe this might look like setting up a shared calendar, either online or, analog, and coordinating everybody who's helping out using this calendar. So people in your family or your extended network likely aren't all going to have a totally uh, equal slice of the pie, right? People often um, might contribute in different ways, and that might be what works best for your family. So there might be someone in your family who maybe they live out of state and they're not able to be there on a day-to-day basis, but they could contribute by making phone calls, by organizing. Maybe they're able to contribute financially to towards the cost of home care, for instance. Maybe there's someone else who doesn't have a lot of extra money to contribute, but they live right next door and they can help by going over and spending time with your loved one. Um, Maybe there's someone else who can help with rides to appointments, et cetera, et cetera. So I think by getting it all out there and talking about what works for everyone, it's possible for the members of your family to commit to something that really will work for them. Expectations are set and everyone knows what they can count on. So the next strategies that I wanted to touch upon have a little bit more to do with the dynamics of difficult conversations where there's tension, maybe even an argument. Um, so the first strategy is to let go of winning. So um, when we're in difficult conversations, there tends to be like a me versus you or us versus them dynamic. But when we feed into this, we often have a less accurate understanding of each other's views, and we might see the other person's position as more extreme than it actually is, right? We sort of vilify the other side, right? Um, and it can, when we sort of buy into this me versus you or us versus them, it feeds into a tug of war dynamic that really isn't helpful. So instead, I'm suggesting to just notice that and instead try and focus on the common goals that you and your family member have. So when it comes to dementia caregiving, the common goal that most folks have with each other is that you all want your loved one to be safe and happy. In the slide, I wrote mom just as an example, but you all want the person living with dementia who you're caring for to be safe and happy. You may disagree on the best ways to get there, but that's something that you all agree on. The more common points of connection that you can identify with each other, the easier it is to move the conversation forward. I'll also say that there, in these caregiving decisions that people tend to disagree upon and maybe argue about, there's almost never one right answer. So these situations are very complex. There's often pros and cons no matter what choice is made. So, in a similar vein, I want to encourage folks to really listen. So, when we disagree and when we're in an argument, it's really difficult to hear what the other person has to say. Oftentimes, when I'm in an argument with a family member, instead of listening to them, I'm planning out the next thing I'm going to say. And I'm planning what I'm going to say that's a rebuttal or the thing that I'm going to say to stick it to them or really prove them wrong. I think it's natural. I think many of us do this. Um, but it's not very helpful, right? So um, it's normal to have different points of view and different opinions because we all have our own worldview. But if we can listen and really try and understand the other person's point of view, even if we disagree, this is where we can move the conversation forward. So, sort of bonus points if we can show the other person that we're listening to them by not interrupting, by maybe even reflecting back and checking in with them. So something like, so I'm hearing that you're really concerned about our mom's safety. Is that right? By doing things like that, we can allow the person that we're in the disagreement with to feel heard and maybe understood, and they may be more open to dialoguing with us and finding a shared solution.
So what I'm hearing you say, hear that phrase that I just used? What I'm hearing you say is that I can't control everyone, even though I should be able to because I'm always right. Obviously not. But I can't control them, but I can ensure that they feel heard if I'm feeding back. So what you're saying is, and that way they know that I'm listening. And that
Yeah,
calms the waters.
yeah, it does. That's a really good phrase. It calms the waters. I think when we try and sort of dig our heels in, when we try and attempt to convince the other person with force, I mean, it's rarely effective, right? But if we can just show the other person that we're hearing them, maybe even looking at what's underneath what they're saying, if they're making some type of accusation or blanket statement, if we can think about what their emotional experience is, oh, it sounds like it's really scary for you to think about um, mom moving into a nursing home. Is that right? You know, that kind of thing. It can really go a long way. This is difficult to do, especially when we're already feeling hurt or angry. Um, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and it doesn't escalate the argument. It de-escalates it. It calms the waters, as you said. So we have just a few minutes left, so I'm at my last tool or strategy that I wanted to share, and that's to avoid blaming. So when we feel hurt or disrespected in these difficult situations, it's normal to want to call out the other person's behavior. Um, Typically, how that's done is with a criticism. Sometimes that's done with name calling. This is common in arguments of any kind, right? But we know that approaching arguments with criticism is just not productive. So we want to avoid personal attacks or character assessments. You know, we want to avoid saying you're a jerk. Um, it can feel really satisfying in the moment to say you're being a jerk. Um, but and while that your anger might be righteous, um, in the long term, it often doesn't get the conversation to the place we want it to go. So what's more helpful is to describe what's happening without evaluation or judgment. So to share from your experience, and then ask for what you need. So many of us maybe have heard of using I statements, and it might feel a little bit awkward to sort of speak in this prescribed way. And I would say that what's less important, you know, it's not very important that you speak exactly how it's written on the PowerPoint here. Um, but the point is that we're avoiding blaming, we're avoiding criticizing the other person. Instead, we're talking about our experience, we're describing what's happening, and we're asking specifically for what we need. So instead of your family member responding in their own defense to your character assessment or to your criticism, what it does is it opens up space for them to instead respond to your specific request for help, and that leads to a more constructive conversation. So, um, some examples are, in an argument, maybe you might say, "I feel hesitant to share when I see you rolling your eyes at me. Can you listen to my perspective without rolling your eyes?" Instead of saying, "You are so rude." Okay, so in that example, if you say to your brother, for instance, you're so rude, your brother might say, "I am not rude. I've always been the nicest one," or whatever. He's going to come to his own defense, right? Instead of responding to whatever your conversation has been about. Another example, I feel overwhelmed with cooking all the meals for mom. Can you please cook or buy dinner for her 3 times a week? Instead of, you never help, right? If it's you never help, your family member may respond with, I do too help. Yes, last week I cleaned out the garage. And then you're getting into a tug of war debate about whether or not your family member ever helps. Um, Versus having a constructive conversation where you're naming your experience. You're really overwhelmed and stressed out, and you're making a specific request for your family member to take care of dinner 3 times a week. So it gives an opportunity for more constructive conversation to occur in this way.
So if I want to be right and I want to say you're rude or you always or you never,
Yeah.
that's a really effective way of derailing the conversation and getting nothing done for mom or for dad or for whoever the loved one with Alzheimer's is. Uh, I'm hearing you say that, and
Yeah.
we've got to let go of that and don't say you always and never. That's a red flag, right?
Right. It's not easy to implement this, right? It's really natural to go here, I think, in difficult conversations and arguments, and I think we all do it. Um, One additional tip I have is to really, if you know you're going into a difficult conversation with a family member, to really set an intention and maybe plan ahead to kind of try and make specific requests. Maybe you can think ahead about what request you want to make, what's feeling okay and what's not okay, and you can kind of practice setting those boundaries. Um, it may feel kind of unnatural even if you're used to a family dynamic where people call names or criticize each other, and that's common in many families. Um, this might feel pretty new, and it's not easy. No one's perfect at it, but it's something to try out, particularly if conflict is ongoing and if it's pretty stressful for you. So again, here are the tips we talked about today. I just want to highlight um, they're not steps to completion, but they're tools that I hope that you can draw from depending on your family situation as you continue to navigate difficult conversations or conflicts or disagreements that are part of um, your family caregiving situation. Lastly, if tensions are ongoing, if this is becoming a source of stress, um, if there's a lot of conflict in your family, it's often helpful to bring in an objective third party, often a professional who can help facilitate these difficult conversations. Um, you don't have to wait for things to get really bad in order to ask for help from one of these professionals. So some options depending on your preferences are, maybe a spiritual leader, a mediator, a family therapist, maybe an attorney, or maybe a geriatric care manager. These folks can all help facilitate different types of difficult family discussions, and it can be quite helpful for families who are in difficult situations.
Well, it sounds to me like it's really important to look to having an objective third party come in because I've seen it a thousand times where, I've been telling my brother or my sister this for months and months and months, and they don't hear it. But then some other person will come in and say it, and suddenly they hear it. And I'm like, I've been telling you that for. So it's we're all that way though. We need that objective third party. Sometimes it's an authority figure to come in and say
Yeah.
something that we have a blind spot around our families. We all do. So one of the great things that's available to everyone, free of charge, is a care consultation. You can call our 24/7 nationwide helpline at 800-272-3900 anytime, day or night, anywhere in the country, and an expert like Julia will set up a care consultation. And that can be something where you go into the office, or it can be over the phone where there's people calling from different parts of the country. And that person from the Alzheimer's Association can be that objective third party. And sometimes you can accomplish more in 15 minutes over the telephone than you have in 15 months. So there's no charge for that service. That's something that you can call and inquire about. And I would encourage everybody to do so. We're just about out of time, Julie. We did have a question.
Yes.
How do you deal with a parent who won't accept that they have Alzheimer's?
Yeah. It's a good question, and it's a very common thing among people with dementia. So sometimes people with dementia um, aren't able, because of their dementia, to think clearly and understand various things in life, including their own dementia, including their own disease. So sometimes I hear family members getting frustrated, feeling like the person with dementia is being stubborn or difficult or in denial. And while that might be true, your loved one might be stubborn. um, what's often more true, is that their dementia is helping them or preventing them from thinking clearly about it. Um, I'll recommend that we have several other programs that are specifically related to communication with people with dementia. So we have a dementia conversations education program and webinar. We also have programs related to difficult behaviors. You can also call our helpline and speak specifically to a care consultant about your situation, and they can talk with you through some strategies to use in navigating communication with your loved one.
And those webinars, Effective Communication Strategies and Dementia Conversations, can be accessed anytime where you registered for this webinar, alzwebinars.org. You scroll down and watch the recordings of previous webinars, and those are there. And a great way to make sure that you're effectively communicating about some very tough topics. But just if I can just throw in there, don't argue. When you argue with a person with dementia, you both lose. So you've got to find a way of avoiding those trigger words like no, don't, stop, and can't. And just take the time. A lot of neurologists are saying that the most powerful prescription that they can write for a person with Alzheimer's these days is education for their family members. So go ahead, avail yourself of those recorded webinars at alzwebinars.org and get yourself and your other family members educated, and you'll find that your interactions with your loved one with dementia will be much, much, much more effective.
Thank you for your
Okay.
question. Yeah, it's tough to deal with those types of changes, and it's stressful no matter what. So thanks for your question, whoever asked it out there.
Great. And like I said, 800-272-3900, get out your cell phone and program that into your contacts, because you can call anytime, day or night. And that is about all the time we have for this evening. I'd like to thank Julia for sharing your time and talent with us.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you all for logging in. I hope that you'll share this webinar with families and friends by letting them know about alzwebinars.org. And we hope that you'll return to alzwebinars.org and join us for a future webinar. Have a great day.